John Kennedy once said that we must abolish the tools of war before they abolish us. And what we remember of that time when he said that was a Cold War era of mutually assured destruction, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Soviets. We remember the bunkers, and we remember all of the hype of that era. And yet we talked about the arms race, the race for arms superiority in the globe. But now what we see are arms races in specific hot regions such as the Middle East. And that is what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at some of the policies. We're going to look at how did we get here. We're going to look at who the big players are. And what does the world look like in a different dynamic of arms races.
Well, thank you for having me on this panel. I think about this a lot in terms of, what are the conflicts that are driving a lot of these arms policies, and also this larger, foreign policy objective by the United States to be a regional hegemon. We want to dominate the Middle East, and what FCNL is advocating for, the Quaker nonprofit and the public interest that I work for, is we are trying to shift away from that view that the United States needs to be this regional hegemon and move to a more diplomacy-based foreign policy where we're not leading, we're supporting diplomatically, but not trying to lead and trying to encourage more regional cooperation. One context that I work a lot on is U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Despite passage in 2018 and 2019 of this Yemen War Powers Resolution, there is ongoing military support that's continued starting under Obama, under Trump, and now continuing under Biden. They've cut off some support, but it comes. There's a lot of aspects to it, but with this war in Ukraine, which is, I guess, the elephant in the room here, it's impacting a lot of our military participation for the Saudis. Because Saudi, they obviously are a massive producer of fossil fuels, and the administration right now is going hand in hand to the Saudi-led coalition in Saudi Arabia and trying to get them to produce more fossil fuels. So this, there's this, regional attempt to dominate the Middle East, but you also have this, dependence on fossil fuels. So I think where, something that I've been working more and more on is, one, trying to, explain to lawmakers, explain to people in civil society this important connection that, yes, we have to end our military participation in this horrible war that's driving millions of people to the brink of famine, pushing people into cholera, but also get off fossil fuels and have a just transition. So more and more I keep bumping up into this, and it's made me have to do more on climate change. And that's, even though I wear this Middle East policy director hat, there's no way out of this. We have to get off fossil fuels if we want to truly extricate ourselves from these authoritarians.
Is our energy policy, I guess, so tied into what is driving the tension in the Middle East? And is that a driving problem for when we look at arms proliferation, et cetera, in the area?
It's a great question, and I think that, and if you look at who is the biggest importer in the world, unsurprisingly, Saudi Arabia. We've been giving, a lot of weapons for a long time, and so I think, at least in my mind, the ways in which this has become so ingrained in every way, from the weapons manufacturers to Congress and the desire to keep up manufacturing and exports of arms to this sort of endless market and appetite around the world, and especially in the Gulf. I think it's very, very hard to change that without really focused legislative action.
Is the evolution of arms sales, foreign military sales, as it relates to a truly diplomatic tool as opposed to a defensive tool? I put it that way because we look at what's happened with the Abrams Accords. We saw right after that, literally within weeks, the $35 billion to the UAE. We've seen it in other instances within the past, and it's not just a Republican problem, it's a Democratic problem. But are we seeing the tie into foreign military sales as pay-for-play diplomacy now?
One of the main reasons you hear that we have to, endlessly supply the Saudis and the UAE with weapons sales, regardless of their human rights, and they even agree with you. Yes, we know they're violating human rights in Yemen. Yes, we know they're attacking civilians, but this threat of us losing business to China and Russia, that's a big concern on the Hill. And I always reply back to them. I said, well, we have leverage. The Saudis would not be able to jump off of U.S. military assistance and equipment overnight and go into all Russian or Chinese hardware. It's just it would, according to Bruce Rydell from Brookings, it could take over a decade. And so oftentimes U.S. lawmakers, they're failing. They're operating from this fear center that if we somehow pull back, that all of these other regional competitors or global competitors are going to swoop in. But it kind of ignores the fact that we have leverage and that we don't have to put up with Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses in Yemen, obviously with airstrikes on civilians, but also assassinating journalists like Jamal Khashoggi. And it's just a horrible repression at home, and we're giving up a lot of leverage. So yes, it is, to answer your question, yes, there's certainly this tit for tat, we'll give you security assistance in, exchange for, greater economic cooperation, diplomatic, connections, but to me, I think there's a better way, and I think we're at this kind of really important moment right now that I think, requires a fundamental, shift in the way we're looking at this whole situation in the Middle East with weapons sales and DCS and FMS sales. So.
Most of the major munitions are on this list requires a license to export, and there are hoops you have to jump through. If it's on the munitions list, for instance, you cannot grant a license unless you can make a finding that it will not contribute to an arms race. Under the Arms Export Control Act, it actually incorporates world peace into the mix. The purposes of that act say this is to promote world peace, and it requires a finding to approve not only that it will be consistent with U.S. national security, but it will be consistent with world peace.
So let's get into back to the policy side of it. It seems to me that foreign military sales and even some of the domestic military sales, or the inter-alliance, like the NATO sales, they seem to go under the radar as far as either oversight or even scrutiny in some instances. Lauren, I'll start with you and then go to Hassan for the same question. Is this a new development in foreign military sales, or is this something that we've seen that has been a progressive problem for a long time?
You've tapped in on one of my favorite topics, which is that it's so hard to get good data on these sales, which makes it incredibly dangerous because, in many cases, we do not know the full scope of the arms that are being exported around the world. We know foreign military sales above 14 million or 50 million, depending on the kind of item and the threshold. We don't have public reporting of direct commercial sales, so something directly from a manufacturer to a foreign buyer that has to be licensed by the State Department. So, suffice to say, there are huge gaps in what we know, both under threshold amounts and also, outside of the scope of what's publicly reported. And furthermore, firearms is increasingly a major gap in public transparency, and of course, smaller weapons are easier to transport and in many ways more likely to end up in the wrong hands. So we're incredibly worried about that, and the reporting that we get through official government documents have really declined over the years, not gone in the opposite direction.
Hassan?
Well, there's not much I can add on to that. Because she's absolutely right. I will say that on top of the actual hardware, there's also this, contracts for these like direct, like logistical support for the Saudi-led coalition. That's one thing that we're really busy trying to, end with Rep. Jayapal and DeFazio. They have plans and announced plans to introduce a new Yemen War Powers resolution. And something that I think is really interesting that I wanted to inject is that they are taking a pretty expansive view of the War Powers Resolution, Article 1 War Authority, and trying to incorporate ending logistical support, spare parts, and maintenance. Under the guise of this Article 1 War Powers, some people have said, well, you got to go through the Arms Export Control Act, and I think it's really interesting that they're trying to use this new vehicle, in particular because it can give them expedited procedural status and get them an actual floor vote. And so often these sales just zip through, and this military support continues unchallenged. So we have to get creative and think about new ways to really challenge this Leviathan.
Right. Full disclosure again, I mentioned earlier, Matt is our legal counsel on the lawsuit where we filed a suit in DC District Court to block $35 billion worth of foreign military sales to the United Arab Emirates based on the violations done in the deal of the Arms Export Control Act and the Administrative Procedures Act. I guess, Matt, this would probably be a good time before we go deep into the talk of the case, is can you kind of explain the Arms Export Control Act and the Administrative Procedures Act, and how does that tie into, militarization or proliferation of arms globally?
Well, let me start with the Administrative Procedure Act, that is basically the way that citizens can sue to challenge government decisions. This applies across the board. Any agency, they can issue a regulation, they make some sort of final agency decision, you can sue under this statute, the Administrative Procedure Act. There are exceptions, however, to this act, and the general rule is you sue them for either making a decision that's inconsistent with law, that's arbitrary and capricious, or that's procedurally improper. So with that background, the Arms Export Control Act, as I mentioned, has a series of requirements, hoops you need to jump through in order to approve this sale. And the Secretary of State has to approve the sale, has to make certain findings. And that's the key. The problem with a lot of these APA lawsuits, especially when they involve military, foreign affairs, is courts are extremely deferential to them, and there is an exception for things that are so-called committed to agency discretion. And of course, what's more discretionary than foreign policy and military issues? Those are the province of the executive. Courts step back and say, hold on a second. So this is a barrier for us. But when the decision isn't done through the proper procedures, you can sue to say you didn't make the correct findings. And that's basically the nature of our lawsuit. The government has approved this sale of the most sophisticated weaponry it owns, F-35s, drones, and stepping back, these are the sort of things that the UAE has been using on civilian targets in both Yemen and Libya, and presumably elsewhere. They will know more about that.
Just one question. You mentioned twice now the findings. Who is responsible for these findings? Who is the organization? Can the Secretary of State just say, I found this yesterday and it was there? Or?
Yes, there are documents that go to Congress. There's actually, in order for this to work, the Secretary of State has to send the findings, make a document that says, I hereby find, etc., and then sends that to Congress. And Congress has a certain amount of time, and I've forgotten the exact amount of time, to nix the deal. Congress doesn't officially have a veto of the deal. What Congress has to do is actually pass legislation, because you can't have a congressional veto over executive action. I can get into really boring law stuff on that. That would be unconstitutional. But so it is the Secretary of State, and there is an official finding which was made the last day of the Trump administration. So,
But in theory, it could be an arbitrary statement by the Secretary of State finding that it's in U.S. interest to support Saudi
absolutely,
Arabia.
absolutely. And the argument would be, well, you know, the Secretary of State found that the sky is purple. Who are you to tell us it's not? You know, that's a crazy thing, but you know, that's a foreign policy military judgment. He found something that is just, you know, absurd, you would think. They would say, well, who are you to say it, if he made the finding? But if he didn't make the finding, then that's a flaw.
Right.
And here, he didn't make the finding that this would be consistent with world peace. He didn't make the finding that this would not contribute to an arms race, or that it was consistent with human rights and United Nations protocols.
But let me jump in and ask this question though. One of the factors when we look at the findings traditionally in foreign military sales approved by the State Department and the Secretary is that there is a certain guarantee that no harm will come to civilian human life, no war crimes, no destruction of civilian infrastructure that would go towards a human rights crisis. Is that something that's just glossed over a lot of times in foreign military sales, or is it something that we just don't see because we're not that familiar with?
Yeah, I think it is glossed over, or it's just, it's easy enough to throw in a platitude, in any document. I hereby find that this would be consistent with human rights and,
Right.
goodness and niceness all over the world, and we're fine. So, but yeah, they don't think about it in those terms, it seems like.
You know, when we are supposed to be looked at as the leader of the defense of human rights, the defense of democracy, and all of these other factors that should be part of the evaluation, and it's glossed over, that sounds like a policy change. Are we at the precipice of possibly seeing new developments or changes in how foreign military sales are done?
I guess as he was talking, I kept thinking about when Secretary of State Pompeo, right after this horrible, horrible bus bombing in Yemen, it killed 40 children wearing these little UNICEF backpacks. They had just, they were on summer school, and he came out and basically, said in front of the world, in front of Congress, I certify that Saudi Arabia is doing everything they can to protect human rights in Yemen, and then, was going to continue this military aid, weapon sales, and then Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated, and then Congress actually stepped in, and they passed SJ Res 54, the first Yemen War Powers Resolution. And that was Congress, I think, a lot of people working on these, war powers issues, Arms Export Control Act issues, we saw some really historic votes happen at that moment. And, the way I look at this is, it's a bit like kabuki theater. The Congress, they have to get really loud when they don't want, certain activities to happen, and when they want to reassert their war authority. And that was a moment where actually we terminated mid-air refueling of Saudi warplanes, and that was a major sea change. It was the first time in U.S. history since 1973, the original War Powers Act, that they passed this and were able to end this critical part of our military support for the Saudi-led coalition. Trump said that wasn't the U.S. being involved in hostilities. These were foreign military sales to the Saudis, and they ended up terminating that. And then the following year, they actually got Trump to sign that into law. It's kind of a case-by-case basis. I don't think, Congress, they say, well, we're going to work on this, but we're not going to touch Israel. Or we're going to work on this, but we're going to, give the Ukraine this kind of military support without congressional authorization. But I will say that with regards to Saudi UAE, I do see a major shift on the Hill.
As we've briefed members of Congress on our lawsuit and our stance on the subject, we always get the same almost the same verbatim language where we say, look, the UAE is doing X, the Saudis are doing Y, the GCC is an issue, and we get the same words. It's complicated. Is it that complicated? is that relation, is the dynamics in the need for stability in the region versus holding them accountable for being a questionable actor at best in the region, is it that complicated?
I think it's complicated in some part because, in some ways, the Trump administration and also the Biden administration kind of wants to have it all. And so you do see this kind of, what I see is kind of a schizophrenic approach in some ways where, for example, in early 2021, President Biden committed to ending all support for Saudi Arabia and the coalition's offensive operations in Yemen, including associated weapons. Nevertheless, we're still going to continue, and we are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and also, providing maintenance and support, for the Saudi Arabia's Royal Air Force. So we have made it complicated in a way because, we don't want to alienate other governments as a U.S. government, foreign policy. And yet, the long-term consequences are catastrophic. So, in my mind, if you were to ask me, I would say halt the sales, bring countries to the negotiating table, like really push forward on the diplomatic efforts full speed ahead. But there are so many conflicting desires within the U.S. government and from within various agencies that we've made it so.
You're going to say that the schizophrenia, where we're talking to some people at state, they totally get it. We talk to NSC, they don't get it. And so even like agency by agency, it's different. Even staffers, different staffers in these different agencies are disagreeing. And, because I think the world, Biden himself is really focused on domestic issues, really focused on COVID, now inflation, the war in Ukraine, it's, there's this whole like negotiation and people fighting, like obviously Brett McGurk right now. I work for a Quaker nonprofit. We do not support weapons. We are a pacifist organization, and we think, flooding the entire Middle East, Israel, Saudi, UAE, Jordan, with these weapons is creating a more unstable Middle East. And I think that's pretty clear. It has terrible, we're supporting authoritarians, we're, overlooking human rights abuses. So we don't support that. There's, other people that would disagree with that perspective, but I see it playing a major destabilizing role. As far as I keep going back to Saudi, UAE, forgive me, but this is where I spend a lot of my time. I've had members actually, members of Congress and staff, they say, well, we got to protect Saudi, we got to protect UAE. We don't, the Houthis are bad actors. They're doing terrible things, launching drone attacks into Saudi, and Iran is going to swoop in. And I say, well, Saudi's policy, like from the beginning of this war, we're now into the 8th year of this war, has emboldened Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis. It has drawn Iran more into the conflict. And, the Houthis, I don't think would have the incentive to be sending rockets and drone attacks into Saudi, into UAE, if there wasn't this, siege of their entire country, these indiscriminate airstrikes. So I would argue that we need a fundamental transformation, and also really have to look at Saudi policy and how it's harming itself. It's almost like giving the keys to somebody that keeps drinking and driving and crashing your car. I mean, this is the metaphor I use for the Hill.
In your experience, do you believe that they have true oversight over FMS?
They're not doing their job, in oversight. Part of it is because, part of it I think is because there is kind of a lack of transparency. So a lot of important sales that, we as advocacy organizations or the public could help bring to their attention and flag for them, we don't see. And it may come across their desks and they may bypass it. So in part because civil society isn't playing as big of a role as it could, they're not doing the job. I think that, there are also, a huge amount of sales, and perhaps, if there were ways to help them distinguish between really risky sales and ones that aren't so much, that could help them. There have been some good attempts at, at helping to define that. Senator Murphy and Lee and others have proposed legislation that would that would require Congress to, affirmatively approve arms sales just of, countries of high risk, meaning those who engage in human rights abuses or where, weapons may be lost or any number of.
But isn't that
other things.
subjective? Doesn't that give a little bit of latitude to the administration advantage
It
White
does.
House?
It does. It's better than what we have.
I really like the flip the script legislation that she's referring to. Right now, it's really difficult. You don't even get an expedited vote in the House, so you can
Right.
introduce a resolution of disapproval to block a weapons sale. For Saudi, UAE, you have 30 days. It's not a lot of time. For Israel and others, it's only 15 days to block a sale. So giving Congress more tools and affirmative tools, if you make it harder, I think it's better than where we're at now.
But it's been our experience in the New York Center for Foreign Policy.